second section of our second session. I'm going to describe my military service career. I think I may have mentioned somewhere along the way that my brothers, one was in the United States Air Force, my oldest brother Tom, and my youngest brother Harry was in the United States Army. I may speak about that later. When I went to investigate joining the service in 1952, late, it was early, it was the spring of 52. The first service I investigated was the United States Navy. And I think maybe it was somewhat influenced by my father during the Second World War, wanted to join the United States Navy as a physician until his head of service at Lacanau Hospital in Philadelphia said, "No, you're not going, you're indispensable, so you can't go." So that could be, and then always the Army-Navy game, I always voted for Navy, so I guess I had sea in my blood. They said, "Yeah, we'll take you." And as I was talking about that with the captain of my football team at Sarasota High School, his name was Gerald Searle. He's dead, long dead, but he was a good teammate, and he knew me pretty well. He did not have to go into the military because his brother George was killed in Queteling, I think, as a Marine, 18-year-old Marine. So, for some reason, he said, "Go, why don't you look into the United States Coast Guard?" Now, I've seen people in my life that have made big assessments of me, and most of them were good assessments, and they pointed me in a direction which I didn't start out in, but worked out fine. He said, "It's small. You seem to operate in smaller spheres better than larger spheres." So I said, "Okay, I'll try that one." So I did try it. I went up to Tampa and took the test. The chief there, the guy was getting ready to retire. And as a matter of fact, I saw him maybe a year or two later on a train going up north, and he looked like death. Enlisted men, it's tough on enlisted men because, they get into bad habits quite often. And normally you see a lot of enlisted men die right after they get out, 40s, 50s, and so on. So, got to watch that. At any rate, I started out by being, okay, you got to go to Miami to be sworn in. So, early May of 1952, I get a Trailways bus in Sarasota. It was right where the bank building at Orange and Main Street, that's where it was. And my parents drove me to the bus and put me on her. And from there I went to Miami, and I stopped off to go to the bathroom in Naples. And it's the only place there was a garage station. It was nothing really that I recall there. Now, admittedly, that was in the night hours because we drove all night until we got to Miami, and then I got off. I went to some park, and it was alive with people, and you can imagine probably what they were all up to. And then I went to the swear-in building, and then they put me on a train to Philadelphia, and then I guess I had to take the ferry across to Camden. I'm not quite sure how I got from Philadelphia to Cape May, New Jersey. And Cape May, New Jersey is where the United States Coast Guard had a training station for many years. on the East Coast. I'm not sure, they might have had one out around Alameda for West Coast kids. But it's a very small service. I think our boot camp class was maybe 40 or 50 people. They came from all over the area and a lot of different backgrounds. And so that was good in itself. You began to realize that you have different kids coming from different around. You're going to learn a bit about society. And so we had pretty rigorous, I think the boot camp, I think two things to remember, one good, one bad. One was I got to be the stroke on the surfboat in a race there at Barnegat Bay. And we won, so I was glad to be stroking ahead of everybody else. The other one was we were doing some cleanup duty around the base. And there was some poison ivy there. And I said, I'm really get poison ivy badly. He says, get in there. So when I graduated from the exercises there, I carried the flag, but I had agonizing poison ivy all over. And, I guess you can't be any special exceptions, even in a small service. You got to do what they want you to do. And they had tested me while in boot camp, and one of the things was I would be a pretty good engineman. So, I fool around with engines as a kid, and so that should be all right. Then I was sent first to St. George, Staten Island, sort of a receiving base for the 3rd Coast Guard District. I wanted to be in the 3rd Coast Guard District because Ann Washburn Garrett, the girl that I met when she was 9 and I was 10, she was living in an area, having graduated from Mount Holyoke College. No, I guess she was still in Mount Holyoke. I guess she was a freshman that year. So at any rate, then they sent me from St. George, which was a lovely old base, brick buildings, this was underneath, just to the east of the Staten Island ferry there, so accessible. Go on Liberty, you just go across the harbor. I think they charge you a nickel then to go across the harbor. Well, the engineman school was at a beautiful estate in Groton Long Point, Connecticut. It was along the Thames River, very close to the U.S. Naval submarine base there. And I had a car. It was an old 47 Ford that I'd gotten from the guy that I worked for in the summers, Marco Cremona. He was getting rid of it. So I had that car so I could go up to see Ann at Mount Holyoke. And we did that a number of weekends. They have an inn up there that I could stay in. The thing that I remember most of the engineman school is I'm going to the berthing area, and there's this guy sitting over across the hall, and he's got all guys sort of standing around him and chat. And so I said, I wonder what's going on. So I walked over, and this guy looks up at me and says, "What do you want, son?" And I realized that for the rest of my life, knowing this guy, he's going to be the top dog. And I didn't meet him back then, and we did get stationed. He got the 5th Coast Guard District, so I didn't see him at all for the rest of it. But it so happened that our lives meshed after I left Philadelphia. He was living here in Sarasota, and he was one of the most interesting men, a man's man, and the women liked him too. But he was born on Boca Grande, Florida. I think it was the 12th of January, 1932. I'm not sure about that. Fred Futch. And he was, for most of his adult life, he was a fishing captain after the tarpon down there. He captained a boat, and he had a boat, and he would take those people from the Gasparilla out, and there were some very well-to-do people that were good clients of his. So he just died, I think 2 or 3 years ago. But I went to his funeral. It was very interesting to see these fishermen who had to leave Boca Grande because of the cost down there. It's so expensive. It's hard to live down there when you're a fisherman. But it was interesting to listen to the people's messages about his life. Well, there you go. You got a person that you meet, comes from a totally different background in your life, who becomes a fast friend for life. So that always has impressed me, that the Coast Guard is small and quite he interestingly enough, my service number was 297381. His service number was 297371. So there are only 10 people between him and me in the United States Coast Guard. So that was the 297 was the 7th Coast Guard district down here. So I then am assigned to New York Harbor Port Security Unit. And the first place that I'm sent to is Ellis Island, where the immigrants came through, and where Lee Iacopoulos saw that I had been experienced there when he went fundraising to remodel and do everything that was done some years ago. So I contributed towards that because of my experience. It was a very, very beautiful building, beautifully, constructed and was kept well and so on. So America is fortunate to have that as a reminder of the great immigrations of the world coming to this country. And how many people I've met along the way who came through there, or their parents came through there. So I'm glad that I had that time. I only was there for 1 month, but it's very historically meaningful for me that I did have that opportunity. After that, I spent most of my time at Pier 9 East River, New York, which is just east of the Battery Park, and which now I think is a tennis bubble club or something or other. And so I lived on a pier and docks and so on, and I was assigned to a 40-foot patrol boat. The first one was Nan, Uncle, Dog, Pete, or something like that, the call letters of it. And the first boatswain mate captain was Johnny Griffin out of Gulfport, Florida, up the road in St. Petersburg. He was a cracker, and we were 2 guys from South Florida, so we got along pretty well. And I love to have control of the boat, and driving a boat in traffic of New York Harbor you got to be vigilant, because particularly at night, it's not like being in the streets in a city. It's everything going every which way, and you got to be constantly on top of running lights and this, that, and the other thing. One of the things that interests me is I only saw 1 dead body in the whole time I was there, which was about 1.5 years. And I loved exploring the harbors, didn't want to be at the wheel. So it was a very vibrant harbor. It's a beautiful harbor to be in. Now, I also was transferred temporarily to Far Rockaway when they needed an ensign down there for a week one time. And then they took me back to St. George briefly for another time. I can't remember why that was. we had to take our patrol boats from Pier 9 River and go across the harbor past Bedloe's Island, where the Statue of Liberty is, and we would fuel up in St. George. And one thing with that boat design is they weren't very well designed boats. They had great power. They had two GM 671 diesels, so they had a lot of power. They were very hard to get going when it's really cold, so we cheated and got cans of ether, and you stick it in the blower there, and you hear the hammers of Thor, but you also got to light off an engine by that. We did some things that were close to the line, but we were having fun and we weren't getting into too much trouble. Patrolling New York Harbor at night when it's cold and the wind is blowing is really formidable. I used to put on practically everything I had been assigned to my foul leather jacket, my turtleneck sweater, right on down to chambray shirts and t-shirts and everything. It was cold out there with the wind howling. And then the thing that interests me a lot at that time, I write these big, gigantic barges heading out to sea, and they were, of course, all full with the garbage and refuse of New York City back then. You can't get away with it now. I don't know how they did then, but I don't know how they do it. They probably have big incinerators for that purpose now. So that was an interesting area. We had an engineering officer named Tiemann. He was our chief honcho, and I was really pretty naive. I remember, I had these common Johns there, and I remember the cleanest one was always the one that said VD or whatever. I didn't wake up to the fact you don't need to sit down. That's a venereal disease thing. At any rate, that showed sort of a, well, Tiemann, he, for some reason, he didn't get along well with me. So he said one day, when I was working up on a dock, boat up on a dock, he says, "Garrett, do you like to travel?" So I don't know, I've never traveled. He said, "Well, you're going to work." So he had me shipped off to Boston to a weather ship. And I go up to Constitution Wharf up there, and I see these two cutters. One is pristine and white and, beautiful lines and so on, and the other was an old rust bucket. And I said to myself, I hope I get the one, the white pristine one. But I didn't. I get the rust bucket. So, before I go on with this, you could get extra pay if you had sea duty. So I think it was $300. So one of the exciting things in my New York Harbor thing is that we were sent out to Ambrose Lightship one day, and we swung Ambrose Lightship, which entitled me to $300, which was like the moon as far as money. They didn't pay it out, but I think you would distribute it when you got out, your hitch was over. Anyway, I went up to Boston on my 21st birthday, and of course in New York you could drink. I'm 18 years old there, so all the time I was there, I could go into any bar or anything. I got to Boston, I could go into any bar because that was the day I was legal. And I remember going to Scully Square and having a dime beer, and I thought, well, we're off and running there. Our ship was getting ready for sea trials to go to sea, to be taken to the Pacific Ocean. So eventually we got to go, I got there the 20th of June, and I think we left sometime in early August. And of course, we were hopeful that we'd stop along the way and see if some of the islands and so on like that. We had a skipper named J.J. Shingler. Shingler was the brother-in-law of Eugene Talmadge, and Eugene was the father of Herman Talmadge. I think I'm right. Those are Georgian politicians of that time. But J.J. was not a very venturesome soul. He didn't want to get into too many ports that he didn't have to. So we never saw it. We went down the East Coast, had a dry run one sea trial, and then we left and went down the East Coast and went through past some of the Caribbean islands. And then we went through the Panama Canal. And of course, I was in the engine room as an oiler. So I didn't see much of the island there. I remember years later going on a chaise lounge. I said I preferred the chaise lounge. I could see everything. Yeah, so we got through the canal, and then we had this officer. His name was Perkins. He was our executive officer. And people didn't really like that guy too much. He was a redhead. I think he might have been an Irish guy, but So we're out in the middle off of Mexico, and we got this anti-submarine warfare thing going on. There's this big round cylindrical steel drum, and all this ASW is hanging down below, so sonar can go off. So some wise guy, I think it was a damage control guy, took and bored a hole in that drum. And so after a while, Perkins sees this thing is sinking. So we get all hands on to getting that thing out of there. But what interested us was there were sharks all galore. And I think some of the kids said, well, it wouldn't be neat if we just dumped needle-nosed Perkins into the Gulf or into the water of Mexico. Then we went up to Alameda, California, where we stayed not too long, but I got a chance to get around San Francisco, and I decided I needed a passport. They were so different to people in San Francisco to anything that I'd never been exposed to before. I had a buddy living in Berkeley at the time, so I visited him. And it was cold. I have never been so cold in my life. San Francisco in July, I had my pea coat on and everything else. So that made me glad I was going to get stationed there. So then we started to steam out and going out the Pacific under the Golden Gate Bridge. It was rough sailing getting out of that harbor that day. And then we started in the Pacific and it smoothed out, and we had a good cruise out to Hawaii. And I remember when I first saw the Hawaiian Islands, it was the island of Molokai off the port side, and Father Damien's leper colony, it was that side of Molokai, just so beautiful. And I said, oh, this is like paradise. And the chief herd that I'd had up there in Groton was a teacher. He was on the ship. And he said, son, he was up there with me. He said, son, when your tour's over, you'll be glad to go stateside again. Because that time, Hawaii was a territory, it was not a state. So he was right. Eventually, 2 years later, I realized he was right. But Hawaii, Honolulu was not packed like it is now. I mean, it was a very quiet. My mother had a friend up in the valley that walked up that mountain on a Sunday afternoon and had some passion fruit with her at her house, but it was just lovely up in there. So and the time we had our hatch open for the berthing area. We had about 35 guys in a very small area, Benjamin, most of them, over the wheels of the ship. And so it would make a lot of noise when there's rough seas there. I went from the engine room, for some reason, they pulled me out of the engine room and they made me in charge of the machine shop and then in charge of all the auxiliary machinery on this old ship. So it was a busy time because everything was breaking down and falling apart and so on. But I didn't have to watch stand, which for me was a blessing. I mean, you had more freedom. originally I stood some watches till I got transferred out of there. I had the 4 on, 8 off, 4 on, 8 off. I think it was four, at the early morning and late afternoon. Now, I'm going to tell you about our charge out there. We were at Sand Island, which is in Honolulu Harbor, so we saw the Lurleen passenger ship coming in periodically. And it was quite well situated. We have patrol boats or boats that would take us to the beach there. And at that time, except for the Royal Hawaiian and the Ala Moana, there was hardly any hotels or anything on Waikiki Beach. There is a guy that I went to school with in the first class I studied in. His name was Joe Farrell. We called him Babo Farrell. He became the guy that was the architect for all the stuff you see in Waikiki now. And he lives in Sarasota now at Glenridge. So it's good to see him after all these years, but what a career he had. Well, so our charge was to go back and forth across to Ocean Weather Station Victor. Now you have to realize they had Loran stations and they had weather ships, and they're no longer in existence because of the modernization of weather with all kinds of electronic things. So it's a totally different world. It's like, it takes me back to when I was in an orderly hospital. They don't exist anymore. So I've lived long enough to see a lot of things that were somewhat important are no longer interested. But when we got through with Ocean Weather Station Victor, we would go into Yokohama Harbor in Yokosuka. And that was, I probably did that in those 2 years, maybe 8 times, something like that. And I have to say that was one of the great treasures of my life. And I'm going to give you 2 stories from that, which probably are the top experiences I had in the United States Coast Guard as far as expanding my horizons. The first one, my mother, when I got over to Japan, she said, "Thee has to go see Shingyo." Well, I'd never heard of Shingyo before, but our mother's family had an uncle of hers whose name was Uncle Me. That must be the kid's nickname. Uncle Me left the United States in the early part of the 20th century and went to Japan, and he never returned to the United States. But he got interested into a young lady whose name was Shingyo Imura. And Shingyo Imura was a very promising student. And so he got in touch with his fellow relatives and said that he wanted to send her to Mount Holyoke College, and the family sent her to Mount Holyoke College from 1915 to 1919. And then she returned to her native country. And so that was who Shingyo was. By that time, when I was there, she had married to a fellow named Tomita, and they had 1 daughter, and the daughter had married an American, and he died, and so she came back to Yokohama with her little boy, and he was there with the grandmother and grandfather. So somehow I got in touch with Shingyo, and she invited me to her house. I think it was on a Sunday afternoon, and it was, I got there, and I guess I walked from the train station to the house. And in the house was a Western-style living room. And she said that she had done that purposely, that her mission in life was to take Japanese young ladies and interest them in attending Western women's colleges. And of course at Mount Holyoke they used to have served tea and all that sort of stuff. So she felt that that would be one way of showing them sort of how to have manners while taking tea and so on. And we talked for hours there together. And the grandson was charging around with a samurai sword, and grandmother was having to pay attention with him because the beautiful Soji screens were all over the place. But that worked out pretty well. Then Tomita, he came back from the races. I guess he was out one of the races. And she had invited a couple, younger couple, more my age than theirs. And so they came. He was a stockbroker, and I often thought if I'd gotten some money put into the Japanese stock market at that time, I probably would have made a fun of things were really rolling. At any rate, we sat down to dinner at one of these low tables, and we had dinner, and she never came to the table. She was in the kitchen, and they had help. I never saw her until after dinner when we said goodbye to one another. So she said, "Cope, I hope you'll come back someday." I said, "Well, next time I come back from the CEO, I'll come and see you." So that was arranged, and I'm going to break here with that story because between the first meeting and the second meeting, I met one of the most interesting persons of my entire life. His name was George Takata. I met him in a strange way. I was on Liberty in Tokyo, Japan, with Donald Damboni, who was an electrician's mate. The two of us had gone together. I think he was I believe he was from Cleveland, Ohio, but I'm not sure of that. At any rate, we went on Liberty and we went to some girly show. And then, no, we went to a steam bath place. And I'd never been pounded so much in my life. This Amazon was beating me up after I'd been in a steam bath. It's a really rather interesting thing to have happen because when you go out in the cold, then you feel limp and you don't worry about the cold or anything else. Then this guy appeared, guy of the streets, he appeared. And he introduced himself to us and he said, "Would you like a guide?" That's where the girly show. He did take us to a girly show. But then he began to, I think we went to dinner together in, it's interesting, Simbasi. It's along the Sumida River. I know that. The Asahi Hotel I stayed in that night. But, so we had dinner with him, and then he said, "Would you like to go to a club?" And we said, "Fine." And we went to this club, and there were all these girls around there, and he always wore sort of a dungarees, turtleneck sweater, and ivory shoes, And all of a sudden, here we are, these girls are at the table, and he's up there singing to the whole crew, like a rock star up there. And that really surprised both of us. So we had a good time with George. And when I came back, probably for Shinyo's second meeting, George, I went on Liberty before, and I said, "I'm going to go do Tokyo by myself. And I went to an entirely different area of Tokyo, and for some God-given reason, here is George Takata. And I said to myself, this is an omen, might as well go along with it. So we got together the first afternoon, and he said, I'm going to take you to the Korakuen, and you can watch a baseball game. So we went to the Korakuen, and the Yomiuri Giants were playing. I don't know who they were playing, but we sat in the stands, and everything was so quiet. And if the ball got hit out of bounds, you handed the ball threw it back to the ball boy. They'd come and bow to you and take the ball back. I mean, it was just totally different from what I was experiencing. So I was rather impressed with that. And then he said, how would you like to go ice skating? Well, I hadn't been on ice skates for a long, long while, since before I went to Florida. At any rate, I said, oh, I'll try it. Well, they rummaged around the skate pile for some time trying to find something big enough for my feet. And they finally found a beat up old pair of racing skates, which I'd never been on before. And then the strangest thing is we get onto this ice rink. There's no American around there, just me. And these guys are like kamikaze pilots roaring around there. We go around for 15 minutes in one direction, and they redirect us for 45 minutes later. And people were actually falling, and there was actually blood on the ice. It was something I'd never experienced before. At any rate, that was my skating there. I made certain I did not fall down because I could have been chopped liver. And then that night, he took me to one of the most interesting things of my life. We went on by train to the shrine area of Nikko, high in the mountains. We stayed at Ryokan for American Air Force people, because I was a serviceman, so I could get in there. And the food was, breakfast was something I never experienced. It was a totally new experience for me. And then the next day we went to the shrines. And that has to be one of the most beautiful places in the world. It's just extraordinary. They say, when you see Nikko, you can die. You've seen Nikko, you've done it all. It's on the lake Chuzenji, let's see, and Mount Nemtai, the sacred mountain, is just behind it. And to tell you the truth, I've been to Nikko 3 times in my life. Now it means I could have had 3 lives. It's a very rare place. I went there one time with my second wife. And then I went one time with a friend of mine who was an artist. And she showed me some of the more interesting things in Japan. But that's not with the Coast Guard, that was later on. So at any rate, we get to the end of that, and we didn't have any money. So I said, if we can get to Tokyo, if we can get back to the ship, I got $20 in my. So we finally, we had enough money to get a bottle of wine and a loaf of bread, and that's what took us back to Tokyo and back to Yokosuka. He goes back to Yokosuka, and he got the money. But Takata has to be one of the most interesting guys I ever met. What happened to him was he was of the age during the Second World War where he was conscripted to be a kamikaze pilot. And that meant he had to go through almost unbearable training. He said he would be glad to get in the plane and go do things for whatever they want. He said it was so rigorous and so horrible that, and it was not, at that time in the war, there was nothing for the emperor. And of course they didn't have enough planes, so that meant that he lived because of the war conditions. And I noticed as I walked through Tokyo with him and wherever I went, people would seemingly recognize him. And I said to myself, I wonder what that's all about. So that's why this is where I come back to Shingyo. I brought him up to her and she said, you know, Cope, after the Second World War, there was healing on our part towards Americans, and so there were some Japanese guys that wanted to be accompany American servicemen, officers as sort of their boy, or in Korea, and that was illegal. He wasn't supposed to do it, but he did do it, and because of that, they were recognized as being supporters of the Korean War, and that they'd done that, and so they were revered in Japan. So he had a very varied life, but he was a fascinating human being, just in my soul. I'd love to know where he went from there, because he was a common man, but he had a great connection with the world. So then I go back to Shingyo. It's a lovely winter day. Snow is on the ground, and here comes Shingyo with a beautiful kimono on, and she gets a hold of me at the railroad station and walks me to the house. And we sit at the same table, except that because it's cold, what they do is they have a pit, so a fire pit below this table, so you can just put your feet into the pit and you get warm that way. And you sit around the table and you eat and drink. And this is the amazing thing. I am about 20 years old and she's about 60 years old at that time. So we eat and we drink exquisitely. She was the directress, so the maid was there. We ate and drank for 8 straight hours, never left the table. She was the greatest hostess of my life. I can way far and away better than anybody else I've ever been to a party in my life. She just can imagine the difference in age there. What's that, 40 years? You say to yourself, what do they have to talk about? But they did. They are Japanese women at that time were very. The man was definitely the big honcho, and they were trained to be back and to do what the man, to entertain the man in the style that he liked to be entertained. And I think that was glorious. My last contact with that was, I was in Haneda Airport in 1984 on my way to Okinawa to see a new grandbaby, and Leah Megan Peters. And I called the house up, and they said that she had died. I think she had died 2 years before, which would have probably made her in her early 80s. And then he had died maybe in the last year. So that was the last thing concerning Shingyo Yamura Tomito. But what a great gift of culturally introducing me to the Japanese people. Now, winding up the United States Coast Guard, I left Hawaii on a U.S. Marine plane. I'd come over by ship, and I flew the whole night through, and then landed in, I don't know, it was Moffett Air Force Base on the west coast of California, near San Francisco. And then I had a flight set up to go from there back to Sarasota, Florida. And what was interesting, I saw at the airport, to me, I saw a prop job take off with a jet of the same line, you could see. I sat till I could watch them, and I was amazed at the velocity of the jet plane versus it's the first time I've ever seen that. They were on the same sort of path. To see the new age was, and I was flush with money. It's the first time I ever had much money because I think I had $600. So that's mainly my service. I became an ensign second class. That was the highest rating I had. I didn't have the motivation. They wanted me to stay in, and I have to say that I honestly thought seriously about staying in, and I'm so glad that I didn't. Because when I got out of this, I said I realized I was never free. And now I value that freedom. So we'll call it a day for, and Bones has been very, very patient, and I thank him very much.
Okay.
All right, now.
All right.
So now we've made good progress.